The Mustard Seed Media video podcast is sponsored and created by Mustard Seed Media, Inc., creating and developing media and web for tomorrow's Christian ministries. On the web at mustardseedmedia.com.
Okay, so let's open up Drupal.org and let's do a little CMS magic. Okay, so let's start with this Photoshop document here, and let's turn this thing into a website. Let's get right down to it and edit some CSS, shall we?
Welcome to the Mustard Seed Media video podcast. My name is Bob, and I'm your host. It's a podcast where we talk about stuff for web designers. Today, we're not going to talk so much about the web, but we're going to talk about Photoshop and a little technique in Photoshop. A couple weeks ago, we had a conference where we talked about stuff for web designers, and somebody came up to me at a break and said, hey, this isn't really web design-oriented question, but he was looking at our Keynote slides. We use Apple's Keynote program, and a lot of the slides had a nice little, and any object that was on the slide, it had a nice little reflection under it. It looked like the object was reflecting on the surface that it was sitting on. And he said, how do you do those? So that's what I'm going to do today is I'm going to show you how to make those in Photoshop. Now, I'm going to show you the really quick, really easy, really basic version, and then show you a pitfall with them as well. But you can get way more extensive on these. You can make them way, way more complex, way more fancy. I'm going to show you the basic version that'll get you by so you can do these real simply. So let's look at Photoshop. I've just got a blank document here. That is just 800 by 600. And I'm just going to bring in an image here. Just a little Photoshop tip. The first thing I usually do when I bring in an image like this is the image's original size. So if I size it down and I want to size it back up again, I'm in big trouble. I can't do that. So I'm going to go over to my layers palette, and I'm going to convert this to a smart object. That allows me to later on resize it back up to the original size without losing quality. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to need some space underneath here to be able to have my reflection. So I'm going to size this down a bit. Then the next thing I'm going to do is to create the reflection, I'm just going to create a copy of the image. So let's copy it onto a new layer. And then it's actually sitting on top of the other one right here. Let's go ahead and we're going to transform this image and we're going to flip it vertically. So now we have two images. And I'm going to drag the second one down. You're seeing how basic this is already. And we're basically having one image on top and then its mirror vertical down below. So now here's the key. There's a couple things that go into making a reflection look at least semi-realistic. One is blur. One is sort of a fade-out effect, and just the other is general transparency. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add a mask to this image. I'm going to go down here in my layers palette, and I'm going to add a mask. If you don't know much about masking, you definitely should learn. It's basically a way to really manipulate the image to alter the transparency of different parts of the image. So I added a mask to this. I'm going to now go over and I'm going to create a gradient mask. So I'm going to grab my gradient tool. I'm going to make sure that it's on black and white up here. And then make sure my mask is selected. And then I'm going to drag from the top to the bottom. And I just made the bottom part of my image semi-transparent. You can already see this is starting to look like a reflection. Pretty straightforward. Now I'm going to pull that image down just a little bit so there's a little bit of space. Next thing I want to do here, though, is add a little blur. Usually, if something's reflecting onto a surface, it's blurred out a little bit. It doesn't look perfect. So we're just going to add a blur. And I don't know. You can kind of adjust it till it looks about right. We'll add about that much. Now, a lot of people would stop here, but as a designer, what happens is a lot of times you get lost in your own work, and you don't realize, probably when looking at this, if you're working on it, that it's way too obvious. It sticks out way too much. So the next thing we're going to do is just grab the layer, and we're going to bump the opacity way down. This image might not have been the best example because you can see it's real solid on the bottom here, so it doesn't give you a real good reflection. But you can leave it there. And then something else to add a little bit of a 3D effect is to grab this bottom and to transform it, do a free transform, and squash it a little bit. It makes it look like it's actually sitting on a surface in front. You can also do some things like transform it. You can skew it left and right a little bit. But that gets us our basic our very basic reflection. Pretty straightforward. Let's do this with text. So if I type in some text, I'm going to go through the same process with the text. I'm going to duplicate. I'm going to transform and flip vertical and pull it down. I'm going to add a mask and do a little gradient mask. Sometimes you got to do it a couple times till it feels right. That's not too bad. I'm going to dump my opacity down quite a bit. So it starts to feel like a reflection. I'm going to blur it. Now, something to note here, when you blur text, what happens is it's going to rasterize the text. So make sure you have a backup of this text if you need it. It's going to tell you right here. It's going to rasterize before proceeding, which means you won't be able to edit your text. I'm going to say OK. I'm going to blur it out a bit. And then I'm actually going to bring the opacity back up just a touch. And then I could squash it a little bit if I want. Then we've got a reflection. It actually looks like it's sitting on a surface there. Now let's. I'm going to give you one more example. This is a trouble spot. Let's say we have a word like encyclopedia for some reason, and we're going to create a reflection of this. You may know already what's wrong here. I'm going to make a copy. I'm going to flip it vertical like we do before. And you're going to start to see the problem already. You have these areas with the Y and the P that come down below this baseline. A really solid baseline like that is what makes reflections look good, what makes them look actually realistic. So when you have something that actually has stuff that comes below that baseline, it doesn't work as well. And it really doesn't work at all realistically. So you could do this, and I have done this before. You could do this and just sort of be like, you know what, it's not going to work perfect, but it's not going to be the worst thing in the world either. And probably only designers will notice it, that it's not actually right. Because, yeah, I mean, other people will notice it too, because it doesn't look that great, but you know, if you wanted to pass, you could. But that's just something to be aware of. A way to remedy this would be instead to use uppercase. Uppercase never has anything below the line, so that's a good thing. So this is just a pitfall to watch out for. Whenever you have things that come below this baseline, it's not going to be nearly as effective. So, very basic idea there. Go ahead and leave your comments if you'd like over at mustardseedmedia.com/podcast. And I'm going to be running out of ideas pretty soon for this podcast. So go ahead and tell me what you want to cover. Next week I'm going to cover something in Drupal. I don't know what yet. But if you have non-Drupal stuff you want me to do, I can do that as well. So that's it for this week. Hopefully, maybe it was semi-helpful, maybe sort of inspiring, maybe. Hopefully. I'll see you next week on the Mustard Seed Media Video Podcast.